I'll be right back. I'm gonna go lock my kids out.
Sounds good. For everyone who has already joined, we're just going to wait a couple more minutes.
All right, you ready to go?
Let's do it.
All right, so I'll start by introducing myself, and then Dr. Unaka can introduce herself. I'm Jamila Hackworth, and I am an assistant professor at Cincinnati Children's and the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. And I'm also the associate director of the Office of Academic Affairs and Career Development within the Department of Pediatrics.
And I am Ndidi Unaka. I work clinically at Cincinnati Children's as a pediatric hospitalist. I'm an associate professor here at Cincinnati Children's, and I'm also the associate program director of our pediatric residency program here in Cincinnati. And we are really excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you for joining us. And the title of our talk, as you can see, is Did I Really Hear That? Strategies for Responding to Racism that Manifests as Microaggressions. So we're really hoping over the course of the next 90 or so minutes to really take a deep dive into why this is so important, give you guys examples of microaggressions, and most importantly, give you ways in which you can combat this in your everyday experiences, both as medical professionals and in your life outside of the hospital. So we're really excited to have you all here, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Real quick, a couple of housekeeping items, if that's what we call them when we're doing this on Zoom. We have Rosevine and Thomas on the line. They're actually helping us manage the chat feature, the Q&A feature, and then wanted me to let you know that if you have questions as we go along in the presentation, please put those questions in the Q&A, and also use the raise hand feature so that one of them can unmute you and you can ask your question, okay?
All right. So just to go over some of our learning objectives for the day. So after participating in this session, we really want all of you to be able to discuss common terms typically used in conversations about diversity and inclusion. We want you to manage one's own racist, microaggressive, and biased tendencies. And we want you all to integrate strategies to interrupt incidents of racism that manifest as microaggressions, both as individuals on the receiving end of biased, microaggressive statements and as co-conspirators. So I think it's always important with workshops like this that we start off with some grounding assumptions. So the first one is the work of equity and diversity is all about creating community. We think this is really important. It involves building trust through careful listening, respectful disagreement, and taking risks. We know that this is super uncomfortable for some people, but having these conversations is how we grow and learn. So remember, it's okay to make mistakes, and we all do it. We also know that individuals and organizations can and do grow and change, but we know it doesn't happen overnight. And so these are going to be ongoing discussions that we have, but it's important to, continue to be persistent as we all try and fight for change. And if we are going to change things, we have to engage in deeply honest introspection. So knowing ourselves is really the first step in creating radically inclusive spaces.
And I would like to kick us off with just a little level setting regarding the unique challenges and obstacles that people of color face in the academic environment. So while it seems as if the finish line is the same distance away, there are a number of obstacles that get in the way, including feeling the need to work twice as hard to prove one's value and competence. Also marginalization and isolation in the academic environment, and this is socially and professionally. There's also a lack of sponsorship and culturally humble mentorship available for people of color in the academic environment. Many people of color face self-efficacy challenges that often result from the absence of role models from their minoritized group. So basically the lack of representation and also the lack of a critical mass of faculty members of color or students. Excuse me. The angry Black woman, this is what I call this. So this is the idea that oftentimes people of color, especially Black women, feel the need to assimilate by employing these bicultural communication strategies, basically to avoid being perceived as either silent and non-threatening, which is invisible, right? Or vocal and threatening or angry. So this is like a constant thing. And I mean, if we were in person, so this workshop, we've done it in person a number of times and heads are nodding and people are like, yes, yes. This whole idea that you're sort of walking this tightrope, constantly trying to figure out how you can manage how people experience you based on perhaps their own biases about women of color. Excessive involvement in diversity related activities or tokenism. And then this idea of the collective representation of all members of our ethnic group, which really makes us feel immense pressure to debunk the stereotypes and generalizations that exist about our groups, which leads to this thing called stereotype threat, which basically says that simply the knowing about the stigma and the stereotypes that exist toward our groups, actually on its own, the awareness and threat of the stigma actually has a damaging effect on our performance. We see this a lot in academics, like when you think about standardized testing, it's a great place where when you look at and you can see that, because what happens is this manifests as self-doubt and anxiety that depletes our working memory and leads to poor performance. There are messages that we are receiving as soon as we're born in the media. Some are covert, some are overt. This is especially true for women and underrepresented minorities. So essentially, you're not good at science. Women aren't good at science. Women are overly emotional. Black people are intellectually inferior. Black people are violent. And these are reinforced day in and day out. And Dr. Unaka is going to share some examples of microaggressions. And so as small children, you know, we're acculturated and assimilated into a space that basically wants to deny us a similar existence as other people. So I think that that's a struggle that many of us face in the academic environment. There's also the fact that many of us are constantly dealing with racism that manifests as microaggressions, both at work or school, from colleagues, classmates, patients and families, and also in society. And so some of these examples include colorblindness, racism, evasive rhetoric. This is especially true, like people don't want to say it's racism, like we can call it everything else, but we don't want to say the R word, right? The normalization of the white experience, which often causes people of color especially to sort of be silent about our own experiences in order to fit in, be liked, or not be the person who's like making the waves and riding the currents, right? References to reverse racism, like let me know what that is when you figure that out. Overhearing negative comments about other people of color. And this is especially true when with the physicians. A lot of this comes from my dissertation, and hearing colleagues speak negatively about Black patients and families is microaggressive. Also, white families not wanting care from Black physicians. So what happens is people of color are frequently forced to choose when to challenge these instances of racism that sort of play out in the form of micro or macroaggressions. Number one, because we have to choose when we're going to challenge them or disrupt them. One, because the fear of retaliation is real, right? And the fear of labeling is also real. And there's also this thing, you know, the lack of publicly supported co-conspirators in order to take on some of this to reduce the burden of disruption that disproportionately lies on our shoulders, right? So what happens is, you know, I don't know how many of you, and you can like raise your hand or you can like raise your finger like this. How many of you have had like in a meeting where you've had to sort of challenge something and everybody comes to you afterwards, like they come to your office and they say, oh my God, I'm so glad. See, look, everybody's raising their hands. I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm so glad, I really support that. Or, you know, or when something happens in a meeting and people come to you afterwards and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. But guess what? Nobody said anything in the meeting. No one came to your defense. No one said, oh, I agree with her. Look at this, it's going, right? This basically is so problematic because while we know that we're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to talk later about this threshold that is present to the amount of disruption that's going to be allowed by us, the business of doing it disproportionately rests with us, that responsibility. And then there's also this lack of safe spaces in order to be able to process these experiences without having to sort of debate them, that they actually happened, right? So this is a couple slides. Ideally, this would have been one big long slide, but the print would have been too small. So this is a scale of racism. So essentially on the far left side of the scale, you have terrorism. And I'm going to flip flop back and forth. And on the far right side of the scale, you have abolitionist. Okay. So this basically, you know, far left is just flat out like, you know, overt racism. Like I'll kill somebody because they're Black, you know, Black face, you know, I just really I want to inflict pain and fear, right? And so as you move along the spectrum, you see at the top, you have like overt racism, subconscious racism, and I'm not going to read these to you because you can look at them as I talk through it. I'll pull out a few. But when you see subconscious racism, you see like Blacks are naturally more violent or aggressive, right? And less intelligent. We're going to talk a lot about that today and sort of how those messages come across to us in the academic environment. I'm not racist, but, you know, or, you know, people in blackface. So, you know, and then you move along to indifference, defensiveness. But what about Black on Black crime, right? you know, they're killing each other. That's something that we've heard a lot, you know, in recent days and weeks. Or justification. So, but what about, you know, Black people can be racist too, can't they? I don't agree with that, but that's something that we've had to debate in different spaces. Oh, wait a minute. We had a Black president, right? So we're in a post-racial society, aren't we? Does racism really even exist? So moving along, you know, you're on white savior, woke justification. So this is, you know, in the, when you talk about like love can conquer all, you know, if we just love each other, you know, that kind of thing. And then you have a performative ally, which if they want my help, they need to be nicer, right? I'll help you, but I need to be the leader, okay? And if I do this, it's going to help my reputation, right? So that's that self-serving part of it. And then you move along and you get, you know, to allyship, which we're going to talk a little bit about, where you have this awareness and awakening that, you know, okay, yeah, you know, like my life was, I was poor, but, you know, it wasn't as hard as if I were poor and Black, right? And then going all the way to abolitionist, which is, you know, using your privilege and putting that on the line in order to really help and take a stand for people of color and other minoritized groups, but allowing them to take the lead, right? One of the things, a couple of things from the developers of this, one, it's super common for people to sort of move back and forth along the scale, especially in the middle areas. And then the term Blacks, when you look at this, you can basically substitute that with any other minoritized group, and it stands to speak the same, have the same meaning.
So now we're going to take a deep dive into microaggressions. And over the course of the next several minutes, not only are we going to dissect this definition, but we're going to go through examples of commonly articulated microaggressions. We're going to highlight the themes that underlie those microaggressions and the messages that those microaggressions send to various marginalized groups. Some of these microaggressions may be very familiar to some of you, either from a place of experiencing them yourselves, witnessing how those microaggressions impact other people around you, or it may even be comments that you've said before. And so I think this is a really important piece of the workshop to really enhance our awareness and for us to learn and grow and self-reflect together. So let's start off with the definition. So when we talk about microaggressions, these are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target individuals based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So I think really understanding what a microaggression is really, really important. I think the last piece of this is really what underscores how microaggressions can be really harmful. So let's take our first example. So how many of you have heard this microaggression before? You are so articulate. You can use the raising your hands. Yeah. Oh, yes. Lots of people. All right. So let's dissect what this really means. Okay. So personally, I have been told this on several occasions, right? So you are so articulate. The underlying theme here is this ascription of intelligence. And the message that this microaggression sends is that it is unusual for someone of your race to be intelligent, right? So here's another example. I believe the best and brightest person should get the job, okay? So the underlying theme here is that this is all about a myth of mediocrity, right? And the message that this microaggression is sending is that people of color are given unfair benefits because of their race. How many of you have heard this microaggression before? Yeah, this is a very common one, all right? So I want you to keep this microaggression in mind because on the next slide, we're gonna talk about, you know, the very stark reality of the culture and the society that we live in, okay?
And this is one I'll just add that I hear a lot on screening committees. And I think we have, medical school faculty on here as well. If you're on admission committees, you might hear this type of microaggression. It's super common.
Absolutely. So how many of you remember the scandal that broke last March in 2019 around college admissions? Yes, okay. So this scandal became public knowledge last spring, and the name of this, the code word for this scandal was Operation Varsity Blues. And essentially, this scandal was something that elite families of privilege from 2011 through 2018 were paying millions of dollars. There were 33 families that paid upwards of $25 million in total to ensure that their kids could get into various colleges and universities around the United States. And not only were they paying to secure admission, they were also falsifying college entrance exam scores, right? So we have the previous microaggression where there's this message that, some qualifications and diversity, can't go hand in hand, right? In order to recruit or retain diverse students, trainees, or faculty, you are lowering your standards. Yet and still, we have this college admission scandal, and I'm sure this was just the tip of the iceberg. So I think the irony here is very striking. So we also, over the course of several years of giving this workshop, we've collected microaggressions that people who've participated in the workshop have experienced themselves, and they have been really kind and transparent with sharing some of these with us. So here's one: you're lucky to be Black because it's so easy to get into college. Yeah, lots of people have heard this one, right? Right? One of my colleagues shared one that she experienced similar to this. Oh, you don't have to worry ever about losing your job because you're Black, right? So it's really just a very interesting mindset that really sends these very negative messages to people. So here's another one. How many of you have heard this one, or experienced or are aware of this one? A store employee following a customer of color around the store. Oh yeah, right? So the underlying theme here is criminality, and the message that it sends to the person who is experiencing this is that you are a criminal and you're going to steal and you do not belong. So here are some other common microaggressions. How many of you have heard this one? I don't look at you as being Black. You are different from all of the others in your race. Yep. Or, your name is so difficult to say. Is there something else I can call you? Yes. Okay. You are pretty to be a dark-skinned girl. Yeah. So here's another microaggression that is super common. When I look at you, I don't see color. And I think this microaggression is one that a lot of people who ascribe to the theme of color blindness struggle with understanding how this can be received in such a negative way. But the message that underlies this microaggression is that you are denying a person of color's racial or ethnic experiences. And so while being a person of color or being in a marginalized group comes with a lot of pain, I want to be seen as a Black woman. I am proud of who I am. And I think when someone diminishes or chooses not to see who you are, it is devaluing. And so that's why this common microaggression of color blindness can be so demoralizing. I think we need to move towards where we celebrate each other's differences and recognize differences doesn't mean that you are better or worse than me.
And I would just add to this. I became aware of this when, you know, I really experienced difficulty with engaging in conversations with people around race. And so my white colleagues and friends had to sit me down and let me know, like, you know, Jamila, I didn't grow up talking about race. Actually, it was the opposite, right? So I grew up and my parents told me, don't talk about race because you don't want to be offensive, like just don't even bring it up, right? And so this notion of colorblindness is actually deeply rooted in white privilege, because people are able to erase someone else's existence. Because if you don't see color, then as Dr. Wanaka said, you don't see me, right? The color of my skin really has dictated a lot of my experiences in my life. So if you strip that away, you sort of strip away who I am. And what happens, the dangerous thing about this is it stifles the much needed conversations about race and the Black experience and all of these other things that really, really need to happen. And so, you know, it was because at my house, we always talk about race every day. I grew up talking about race on a daily basis. So understanding that, you know, we're starting in two different spaces and we need to give each other grace and understanding, but we have to have these conversations. Like, this is definitely not the answer moving forward if we're really going to make a difference.
So how many of you have heard this microaggression? You speak good English. Yeah. Yep. So the underlying theme here is being an alien in your own land, and the message associated with this microaggression is that you are not American. And, you know, I would say on a personal level, I am the daughter of immigrants. My family, both of my parents are from Nigeria. And I remember being a young girl, and my mom would come home so upset. And she would tell stories about how, you know, her colleagues would say, you know, you have a really thick accent. You have a really thick accent. And my mom would always, her response to that microaggression would be, well, to me, you have an accent, right? And so I think sometimes we think that in our dominant culture, that our perceptions of, you know, how people sound is the dominating perspective, but we forget what it's like to be on the other end. And so I think this is a really common microaggression that can be pretty damaging. What about this one? As the only woman, I know exactly what you are going through. How many of you have heard this? Yeah, okay. So the theme that underlies this microaggression is the denial of individual racism. And the message that this microaggression sends is that your racial oppression is not different than my gender oppression, and I cannot be racist because I'm just like you. And I think this particular microaggression is super important for us to dissect. So this really highlights the importance of people understanding intersectionality, okay? So as a Black woman, I am both, obviously, oppressed from a racism standpoint and a sexism standpoint. Like, I've had both of those experiences. And while, you know, a colleague who is a white woman can certainly relate from experiences of sexism, by no means does that negate my experience as a Black person. So intersectionality means that those experiences, having the experience of two or more marginalized groups, means that my experiences are compounded. My difficulties, my challenges are compounded because of experiences of racism and sexism. And so I think this is a really important concept to understand, because I think people in saying this want to be relatable, but it negates the experience of being a person of color. So here's one. Persons of color being mistaken for service workers. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So the theme here is second-class citizenship. And the message that it sends is that people of color are servants to whites. They could not possibly occupy high stakes positions, right? So this is something that I see my students, my residents, they get mistaken for service workers all the time. And let's be clear, this is not an indictment on being a service worker, right? I think service workers play an incredibly important role in our society, and there is dignity in every job. But I think the fact that whenever a person of color identifies themselves as a medical student or a trainee or a physician, and people automatically assume or don't hear that piece and ascribe them to a role of a service worker, that says a lot about what Black people are allowed to do in their minds, right? And so that really is what's underlying that microaggression.
And so this is another one that was shared with us during a previous workshop and okayed to share. This one sort of feeds into this misconception that America is a post-racial society. So I know you're too young to have experienced racism in America, but that's microaggressive. And then this is a thing that I don't even think it's a microaggression. I just think it's flat out racism, but I wanted to talk about it because it's a thing, right? It's the thing is white people calling the police on Black people for like existing. So on this slide, you can see represented are, you know, the police being called because a Black family is barbecuing in the park. A young man is moving into his apartment, and I guess people assume that he shouldn't have been moving in or that he was up to something nefarious, and the police were called. The police being called on a Black man whose dog is at the dog park humping on another dog. Or a Black man who's taking a phone call in the lobby of a hotel that he's staying in because the people staying with him were asleep, so he didn't want to wake them. A man trying to cash his check at the bank. Starbucks, that's this in the center here. The Black graduate student at Yale University who was taking a nap in the common area of her residence hall, and the police were called on her. I mean, there's so many other examples. People trying to do their jobs as delivery workers. Cincinnati just had to pay out about $250,000 because someone called the police on a Black realtor and his client, also a Black man, who were looking at a home on the west side of town, and the police came and botched the response to that. The city ended up having to pay out $250,000. So, you know, this idea of people calling the police on Black people for doing things that, you know, we should all just be able to do is extremely problematic. And I'm going to show a video right now to sort of show you how this weaponization of whiteness against Black people plays out.
Would you please stop? Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in the Ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops. immediately. I'm in Central Park in the Ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. So I just wanted to illustrate that, and I think that video is a perfect illustration for when whiteness is weaponized, and also, Blackness is perceived as a threat. And this is a really dangerous game. It's a dangerous game that many of us are, every day terrified about whether or not my husband or my children will make it home if they have encounters with the police. This is real live anxiety that people of color face on a daily basis. If you're caring for patients and families who are Black or brown, this is our reality, right? Constantly talking with our children, talking about how to respond if you're pulled over by the police, constantly trying to police yourselves, making sure that you don't put yourself in a situation where this could even happen to you. This is one of those outside of work things that, it is an extremely heavy burden. And so the dangerousness of this game is when you do these things, these are pictures of some of the unarmed Black people who have been murdered by police, right? So calling the police in situations where the police really don't need to be called, and there's racism and bias sort of driving that decision and that perception of threat because of the Blackness or because people are looking out of place, like we have to really learn how to dissect, the biases that we have and begin to really think about when those biases are playing out and how they may potentially be damaging or life-ending in some of these cases for individuals. And so that's something that I hope it's a call to action. We all have bias. I don't think we can get rid of it. I think we can learn to mitigate it. I think we can learn to accept where we are, understanding it, and then figuring out how we can reduce the likelihood of harming other individuals. And, I always say, my grandmother used to say, when you know better, you do better. And that's why we're all here. And Dr. Wanaka said, we're going to give ourselves some grace. We always make mistakes. Some of these things we're going to say, people come up to me afterwards and they say, oh my God, I've been doing that one thing. I'm like, it's okay. When you know better, you do better. This is something that we must do better about, because right now we're talking about these people, right? We're talking about Breonna Taylor. We're talking about George Floyd. We're talking about Rayshard Brooks. And one that really hits me in the gut, and I'm gonna try to hold it together, is Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain was a gentle human who used to play violin for cats at the shelter so they wouldn't be lonely. And one evening he was walking home from the convenience store, earbuds in, face mask on because he was anemic and he used it to stay warm. And someone called the police. And what the person said when they called the police was, he looks sketchy. He might be a good person or a bad person. Well, that was enough for 4 officers to respond to block Elijah's pathway. Elijah was on the autism spectrum, I believe. So I'm just gonna read some of the words that he said. He said, I am an introvert. Please respect the boundaries that I am speaking. The officers repeatedly ordered him to stop tensing up. He said, I was just going home. I don't have a gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't even kill flies. I don't even eat meat. I'm just different, he whimpered. He died in police custody a year ago. We hadn't heard about this until, I think a lot of attention had been refocused on his case and the people who were seeking justice for him in Colorado after the murders of the individuals, the other people on this slide. And I just want to say that you must understand that this is a significant burden that people of color face. And it is something that we are going to most definitely have to stop assuming, malice, and making this collective indictment on people of color. While many atrocities in society have occurred at the hands of Caucasians, however, whiteness is never perceived as a threat, and Blackness is not weaponized in the same way, right?
And so I think to build on Elijah McClain's experience in his murder, there was actually press recently about a photo that was released by the Aurora Police on Friday, July 3rd. So these are the 3 officers who are reenacting the carotid chokehold that was partially responsible for Elijah McClain's death. In addition, he got a dose of ketamine in the field for reasons that I don't even understand. And these officers are reenacting a chokehold near the memorial of Elijah that happened last October. So all of this just emerged this month, and these officers were fired. And, the 4th officer was fired for texting "ha-ha" in response to these photos. And so, I think what is so interesting, I think there has been a collective awakening in our country, but for those of us who've been very aware of so many instances of police brutality and the killing of Black and brown people, this is nothing new under the sun. And I think this particular just disregard for who Elijah was is just so sad and triggering, and just like Dr. Hackworth said, when we know better, we got to do better, and we got to fight for the right things.
Thank you. So we would be remiss if we didn't include also the fact that microaggressions, many of our colleagues who may not be people of color, and some of these colleagues may also be, Dr. Unaka talked with us about intersectionality. Some of the microaggressions that our LGBTQ colleagues may face. So again, remember, these are examples that were given to us during seminars, and you can feel free to raise your hand if you've heard these things. I'm not being homophobic. You're just being too sensitive. You're too pretty to be a lesbian. Where are your wife and kids? Why are you not married yet? Do you at least have a boyfriend? I see your hands. I see your hands. As women in the academic environment, we face some microaggressions. I'm going to give you a few examples, and I think you can raise your hand, sisters on the call. This idea that, we might have an idea or propose a statement or something, and it sort of falls on deaf ears. But if a man in the room says it, it's like the most brilliant idea this side of the Mississippi, right? Yeah, I see your hands. I see you. I feel you. Yes, sisters. Oh, I wouldn't have expected you to be a science major. Students on the call, anybody ever heard this one? Yes, raise, please. We hear you, we feel you. Given what your husband does, do you really need to work? These are real microaggressions. Oh, she's just a PhD. Anybody heard that one? I see the hands. Why do single girls need such high salaries? We have wives and children to take care of. What do you need so much money for? Now, all my sisters who are on this call right now, who have children, and you are, you know what? I guess my brothers could experience this as well. So, when we drive up to the school and we drop our children off and you run into another parent who might be a stay-at-home parent or who has more flexibility, whatever, and they say to you, are you coming to tonight's school event? Or are you too busy? As if we already don't have enough guilt that we can't make it to every school event. Yes, raise your hand. Yes, I see you, I see you. Now, this is one that hits me in the gut too. So I happen to work with a team that a lot of folks on that team are a lot younger than I am. And I have had to interrupt a statement like this many, many times. When are you going to start having kids? You know, the clock is ticking. People are raising their hands, right? What we have to understand, sisters and brothers, and you listen, we cannot make assumptions that everybody, A, wants to have children, or B, that everybody can have children. I literally have two friends right now that I've been friends with since I was 12. One's 46 and one's 47, and they have just had their first children. One in January and one yesterday. They have tried for decades to have children. They have had failed pregnancies. They have spent tens of thousands of dollars. This has been an extremely traumatizing experience for them. So when somebody rolls up on you and says, you know, the clock is ticking, when are you going to have kids? We don't know how aggressive and harmful that statement can be. So please don't do this. So listen, all of these ridiculous things that we've sort of said and given you examples of, offensive, you know, and listen, and I'm going to say a lot of times people are not trying to be hurtful when they say it. And that's why we're having this talk, right? Because we want to make sure we sort of open up the discussion about it, because we have to learn how to separate intent from impact. Just because I intended for something to not be received in a bad way does not mean that it didn't impact somebody in a bad way, right? So these types of statements often lead to what I call response paralysis. Something is so offensive or just ignorant that you're just speechless. You don't even know what to say. Raise your hand if you've ever been in this situation. Right? Oh, yes, I see. Yes. And so what happens is, in my experience, this state of response paralysis has like after the fact been characterized by the creation of a plethora of post-situation comebacks that are like really good. Like, oh, I could have said this. I should have said that. I could have said this, right? But in the moment, I didn't say anything because I was like, I was paralyzed and looking like this little girl. And then I also call it the WTF bubble that pops up like, psh, WTF just happened, right? Everybody, yes, people experience that. Okay.
All right. So now what we want you guys to do is take a couple of minutes to do some self-reflection, okay? So think of a time where you were on the receiving end of a microaggression or witnessed a biased or otherwise offensive comment directed at someone else that left you in a state of response paralysis. And that piece is super important. Think about one incident that let you totally shook and just speechless. And we just want you to either think about it or you can jot down a brief summary of this experience. And then in a couple minutes, we would love to have a couple of people who were interested and willing to share their experience with the group go ahead and talk. So we'll give 2 minutes and then we'll come back together.
And real quick, before that, I've just been made aware that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Yes. So do you want to, let's do the questions first?
Let's do the questions first and then we'll do the reflection after that.
Okay.
Do you see the questions, Jamila?
Yep, I'm getting to them.
Okay, perfect.
All right. What's the difference between macroaggressions and microaggressions? Is one more blatant than the other? Because some seem too large to be microaggressions. Exactly. That is exactly the difference. Okay. Hello. I grew up in a household where race was not really discussed. I am white. And the conversation about not seeing color and how that creates microaggression was really eye-opening. Can you suggest resources or methods that will help me avoid recreating this situation in my own children? Absolutely. Actually, what I will do is our office has put together a lengthy list of resources that are categorized in a variety of different ways. And so one of those is raising anti-racist children. It's also engaging in anti-racist work, developing awareness of white privilege. So when we get finished today, I'm going to send you a short evaluation, and I'll attach that list of resources to that email. Okay, sound fair?
Yeah, and I'll give a good example of a macroaggression. We're going to actually get into some of that later on, but someone refusing service to you because of your skin color. I mean, there's nothing micro about that, right? When we think about microaggressions, it's kind of a misnomer, right? Because I think micro has the connotation of being small, but there's nothing small about the impact of microaggressions, particularly when those microaggressions can be very cumulative for the people who experience them, right? So I think that's a really wonderful question. Just because we call it a microaggression, by no means does that mean that the impact is small.
Right. It's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. You know what I mean? Like they just come so often. A couple more questions.
Oh,
I hear we want the best and brightest recruits, regardless of race, frequently. How do we tackle that systemically? And Dee Dee, do you want to talk about that?
Yes. I think a really good response to that is we do too. And guess what? Diversity is just an added bonus because everyone that we would consider is great enough to do the job. And I think also really being able to talk about the importance of a holistic review of an application, whether that's from the student level, the resident level, the faculty level. I've been an associate program director now for 9 years. And I think there are people who bring so much to the table. And I constantly say that a test score is just one piece of information. And there are plenty of people who can take a test, but I would never want them to care for my patients, right? And so I think you really pushing the narrative about the importance of looking holistically at an applicant and the benefits of diversity for the people who work alongside those colleagues, and the importance of recruiting a workforce that actually reflects the patient population that we care for.
We have a couple more. How do you address macroaggressions or issues within your own race while trying to tackle the greater system without members of your community thinking you're being divisive? I'm assuming that this individual is, okay, Rosevine, you're answering? We can't hear you, Rosevine.
She typed in and said, no, she's not answering.
Oh, it looked over here. It said she was going to answer it live. Okay, I'm assuming that this is a person in the majority race. Is that a correct assumption? We're going to talk more about sort of, being a co-conspirator. I think one of the, and Dr. Unaka in a couple slides is going to talk about a quadrant of overcoming silence and rage, where my one suggestion for that is we're just going to have to lean into it, right? We're not going to need to be worried about people's perception of us. If we're going to do this work, we're going to have to understand that, you know, maybe some people may not like us, some people may view us as being divisive, but we have to just sort of make a decision as to whether or not we want to push for change, because I think those are sort of speed bumps along the way that are just going to be there, and we're just going to have to roll over them and keep it moving. Do you have anything else to add, Dr. Wanaka?
Yeah, no, I agree. We're going to take a deeper dive into this, but I would say the one comment that I would say is that there's some people that you're not going to change their minds. But I think to really uproot systemic racism means that we really have to focus on procedures, practices, and policies that disproportionately impact people of color, right? Because that's where the impact really matters. You know, I think what we're doing now around education and awareness is so important, but that is very surface level. I think if we really want to make change, it's really going to be focusing on policy. And I think it's going to be a recognition that you're not going to change every individual depending where they are on the spectrum of racism that Dr. Hackworth shared earlier. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations to keep in mind as you're trying to figure out how and when to combat some of these microaggressions as well. So we'll get into that in the latter half of the talk.
Yes, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we're just going to have to be disruptors, right? You know, and with that comes, you know, the great and the ugly sometimes as well. A couple other comments and then we'll move forward. The resources, Mandy asked, she is a white woman who has Black children. Absolutely. I think a lot of those resources will be relevant, and you have my email, and we can talk offline about that, because your awareness of that is huge, and it's going to make a huge difference for your children for sure. Marianne says, I see lots of case presentations where it's stated race irrelevant. Isn't that color blindness? Absolutely. Because yes, absolutely, race is relevant on all levels of experience, of process, procedure, everywhere. So yes, thank you for saying that. I think we're empty in the Q&A for now. So Dr. Wanaka?
Yes. So how about we take a couple minutes, have you all do some reflections, and then we'll pick on a couple of people who would be willing to share their experiences with this state of response paralysis. All right. Is there an individual who would be willing to share? And if so, if Rosie, you can identify them. Looks like we have a few volunteers. So Rosie, do you want to unmute one of them for us?
I have Farida unmuted.
Perfect. Farida, can you, I don't know if you're already talking. Do you mind sharing your experience with us?
One second. I think my hand was raised from a previous question.
Oh, okay, no problem. We will pick someone else, no worries. Rosie, is there anyone else?
Okay, I don't see anyone else. Oh wait, I see some people. I see Chris Nandor.
Yeah, so one thing was a couple summers ago, a coworker who I'd met about 3 days before found out I was queer, and I'd met him like a week before at most, and he told me, "Oh, if you ever get married, you need to invite me to your wedding because I've always wanted to go to a gay wedding."
Yeah, that is a really great example, and it's just so hard to even know what to say in the moment. Thank you for sharing. Is there another person who would be willing to share?
I'm going to unmute Awura Ama Odoro.
Hi, so I'm currently a pharmacy resident and I was supervising a pharmacy intern, and we were just casually having conversation with everyone on the team about families. And he goes on to ask me, how are my kids? And I was like, oh no, I don't have kids. I'm not married. And he was like, that's okay. I don't discriminate. So he assumed that, I don't know what his assumption was, but I could have kids whether I was married or not. So that assumption just rubbed me off the wrong way.
Oh yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And so
I have one in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. I've had so many experiences in my 64 years as a white person. So here's one that popped up in my memory. I led a team of folks from Ohio to help with the Katrina recovery. So that was in Mississippi and Louisiana. When I got back to the office, a white male coworker stopped by my office and said, those people should just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, which is one thing. And then also, as the person who submitted it states, there's also a huge assumption that every one of the people impacted by Hurricane Katrina was a Black person. So yeah, there's layers to that one. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. How about we take one more and then we'll move on to the next slide, which will also give folks an opportunity to share as well.
I'm going to unmute Patricia S.
Okay.
All right, can you hear me?
We sure can. Hi, Patricia.
Hello. So this is one that I didn't realize until we had a meeting about it, that I've heard this so often that it's just part of language in hiring. But we had a meeting with executives in our company, specifically Black women, who were talking about the term qualified applicants when talking about we need more representation, we need to go into communities and schools and look for people of color, specifically Black people, to get into our industry. And whenever we switched to talking about minorities, it was always, well, we need to make sure they're qualified. So there's an assumption that they can't be just average, they have to be exceptional in order to get this entry level job. So that it didn't dawn on me until they started talking about it. And, oh my gosh, like every meeting I've been in where we've talked about hiring has that term in there somewhere.
Yep. That is a common one. It's the assumption that to prioritize diversity, you have to deprioritize having qualified applicants. And it's the assumption that people who are in the majority are automatically assumed to be qualified, right? I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. That's really what that gets at. And I really appreciate you sharing that.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move on to the next slide because I would love to get thoughts here as well from the group. So why do you think we often have response paralysis when biased comments are made towards us or in our presence? We'd love to hear a couple of thoughts here. And if you raise your hand, Rosie can unmute you.
I'm going
Looks
to
like Danielle.
Yes.
For me, it has been, the response has been, oh no, you're overreacting, you're becoming too angry, you need to calm down, even though my white colleagues would be just as enraged, but that's not being enraged, that's just an acceptable response.
Yes, so the stereotype threat that comes along with being a woman of color, that stereotype threat is often ascribed to Black women. So again, you know, there's not a ton of room for disruption of microaggressions by people of color. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
Allison Chartrand.
Yeah, I think when I've experienced microaggressions about my intelligence, I have response paralysis because I kind of internalize what they're saying. I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I'm not really smart enough to be in this PhD program? And it's imposter syndrome plays a big part.
Ooh, Allison.
Girl, it'll have you thinking you're not supposed to be in places you done prayed to be in.
You know what, this is really important for people to understand. Again, micro being a misnomer, because these cuts cut at our confidence, they cut at our self-resolve. I had a former resident text me the other day and talk about this very thing, how she recognized that her imposter syndrome came from the stereotype threat or her worries that she was just going to fulfill this prophecy that people were projecting on her. So she never would answer questions because she didn't want to be wrong to prove them right. And it just hit me, and it just wrecked me. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, Allison, because I think that is so true.
There's some in the question and answer. First, I'll back up. There was one example that someone put in of a microaggression. I worked at a golf course and I was vacuuming something that was part of the job, and this person identifies as female. A man came up and said, "You'll make a great wife one day." She said she had to bite her tongue because she needed that job. Yes, for sure. And then so with the current question that you have, why do we think we're often left in a state of response paralysis? There are a few. So Tanya says the fear of confrontation. Anonymous says trying to be polite and not cause disruption. Also personal insecurity. Another anonymous attendee says best intentions, don't want to make it worse, especially for the recipient, but there's a lot of cowardice too, I think. And then another anonymous person says, you need to be mindful of the hierarchy that exists, especially if you're on the lower end of that. Absolutely. And then, let's see. Charis says, yeah, with my experience with homophobia, I was dumbfounded, but also had a hard time telling if it was really bad, really that bad, because my coworker was saying a positive thing about queer people until I talked it through with friends later. So.
Yep. I mean, you guys really hit on all of the reasons why response paralysis ends up being, you know, what happens in the moment. And so we're going to actually take a deeper dive into this, talk about some of the reasons for response paralysis. And then this last part of our workshop is really going to be focused on giving you all the tools to combat microaggressions that you either experience personally, and we're also going to give you scenarios of how to combat this as a co-conspirator.
And I think, oh, someone had his hand up. Michael?
Oh, yeah, Michael, do you want to share?
I think we have 2 raised hands.
Yeah, that's fine. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, Michael, the only other thing I was going to add to it is I think it's also important, I think, for especially people in the majority to recognize that silence is power. And so, you know, I don't know how intentional people are when they don't speak up about thinking about that, but they are protecting their power by not speaking. Because if you ignore it and you don't talk about it, you put a person in a place, and it's, you know, people don't want to upset the power structure.
Yep. Michael, that is real talk. And I think the flip side, you know, for the majority, silence is power. And I would say for those who are marginalized, when those in power are silent, silence is violence, right? Because it allows it to continue on, right? So I really appreciate that comment. Thank you.
One more. Later, you feel so ashamed and you think of all the things you should have said.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep.
We're going to fix that today, though.
Yes. So, Dr. Hackworth referred to this earlier on in our workshop, but I think this really speaks to a lot of the reasons why we are paralyzed in the moment, right? And so I love this diagram, how to overcome silence and rage syndrome. So if you look at the horizontal line, from the far left, we have silence, and as we move closer to the far right, we move more and more to challenging microaggressions and other acts of bigotry more directly. And then on the vertical axis, we have rage at the bottom, and as we move up vertically, we get to caring personally, right? And where we really want to be is in that upper right-hand corner, right? How can we have radical candor, right? And the benefits of radical candor rather than us, you know, being silent and not moved, or us being really rageful, but our fear for disrupting what's happening really keeps us from saying something in the moment, right? So we're hopefully going to give you guys skills to be able to disrupt microaggressions with radical candor. So I think what we're going to do right now is to talk a little bit about what to do before you respond, because I think these strategies are super important, right? You need to make sure you ground yourself and prepare yourself before you actually have the verbal response to microaggressions. So the first thing is to stay calm and breathe, right? And then think about a few things. Determine if the juice is worth the squeeze. Resist the temptation to respond right away, because we know that if we respond right away and we're responding from a place of anger, it could make the situation worse, right? You might garner some temporary relief, but it can have negative implications for your reputation, and that's just real, right? And then sometimes you may just need to take a whole step back and go process your feelings with people that you trust. That can be a trusted peer, a trusted mentor, someone who can give you sound advice about how to actually address the microaggression. The next thing you want to do with your pre-work before actually responding is determine what your actual goal is, right? So is it enough for the behavior to stop? Will an apology do, or would you like there to be a higher level of accountability? And this is super important. What type of relationship would you like to have with the person after confronting their bias, right? So really think about what your goals are, because that's going to inform how you actually address the microaggression. Next, we got to think about flies, honey, and vinegar, right? So this is all about not what you say, but how you say it. So the delivery of the message often informs how the person is going to receive it, right? So we got to think about tone. It is critical because we know that if we're going to call someone out on their bias, it can make that person feel attacked and judged. So how we deliver the message becomes critical when we're talking about addressing microaggressions.
My grandmother used to always say, you'll get more flies with honey than you will vinegar, girl.
And then finally, thinking about focusing on the occurrence and not the person. This is so important. You want your conversation and the critique to be focused on the behavior, the event, or the comment, right? And if you are focused, that can diminish defensiveness. And you want to stick to the facts. Don't make any judgments. Don't make any apologies. Don't have any self-subrogation. Like, just stick to the facts and how the behavior, event, or comment meant, how they affected you, or meant for what they meant for you in that situation. And then this is key. Consider the relationship. So assess the type of relationship, your investment in that person's development, the long-term status of your connection with that person, and the risks, right? So this is super important for trainees and students, right? This is where this really comes into play. So is this person someone that you work with closely or not, right? So that goes back, is the juice worth the squeeze? And is there a power differential where speaking up has perceived or real risks? And if so, you got to think about your strategy. And this is where talking to an advisor or a trusted mentor can really come into play. And when there is a power differential or a fear of retaliation, getting the support of senior leaders or an ally can be really, really helpful.
And I'll share an example here of one of the many instances where I've had to interrupt microaggressions and bias in my workplace. There was a situation where a very powerful white male made a comment in front of over 100 people. And it was a comment that had been made, I found out later, in reference to a structure for at least like 16 or 17 years. Someone said like the low person on the totem pole. So I viewed myself as the low person on the totem pole when compared to this individual. So the comment was made in a faculty meeting. Of course, everybody was upset. All the women in the room were upset. So what happened? There was a meeting after the meeting, and there was a group email and a group text after the meeting, and everybody was just like, I cannot believe he said that. And my thing is how unfair is it to him that he can sit up there comfortably and talk about the fact that they've been saying this for 16 or 17 years and no one has challenged him on that? Like, he doesn't know. He doesn't know that it's offensive. Should he know? Yeah, that's debatable, right? But obviously no one has ever said anything to him. So I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. So you know what I did? I emailed my chair and I said, you were there. You heard it. I'm sure it affected you it affected all of us. And I actually want to say something, but I'm little old me over here with imposter syndrome and all that other stuff and the skin color that I have, right? And I said, I need to know that you have my back, right? She said, I have your back. She said, a lot of people here, they respect you. He respects you. And I think he will hear it from you. So I set up a meeting in my office and he came to my office. It was a beautiful conversation. He was so humble. It was a lot of bonding. It was very difficult for me in the end. I felt like I gave him a gift that people had been not giving him for many, many years. He emailed the whole group, apologized. And ever since then, that uncomfortable moment has created a relationship between the two of us where I'm his person if he has a question, if we have anything related to, educating people about minoritized groups, so women, LGBT, Black, he's always like, can I come and sit in the back of the room? I want to learn. Absolutely, right? So I just say that to say, sometimes you just need to get some help from someone else to know that they have your back. And then, as Dr. Unaka said, if you're a student and it's a faculty member, you may even need to get your mentor to intervene on your behalf. So, you know, depending on what the differential is and the possible outcome, I think that getting somebody who's above you on the hierarchy to support you, to sponsor you, to help you, to intervene for you is a very helpful strategy.
And then this is super important. So, you know, I readily admit that I do not have a poker face. Okay, so if I am the receiver of a microaggression, or if I am observing something go down, like, it is all over my face, right? So it's really important for us to fix our face, right? That is key, right? You got to fix your face, because that, as hard as it is, and I readily admit I am terrible at this particular pre-game planning for how to address a microaggression, but I do think it is something to keep in mind. All right, so now we're going to talk about some strategies for responding to bias. And so first, we're going to do it from the point of view of you experiencing it personally, and then we'll move to the co-conspirator combating this, okay? So this is one that has happened to me too many times, all right? So me as the female physician being mistaken as a nurse, right? And let's be clear, again, I have so many friends who are nurses. I respect the nursing profession. I work alongside them. I cannot do my job as a doctor without nurses, okay? However, it is often that women physicians are mistaken for nurses. And so when this happens, one way that you can combat this when this happens to you is to say something like, "Thank you for the compliment, but I'm Dr. Unaka, and I'm so happy to be taking care of your child today. So tell me what brings you in," right? And I think, you know, really, you know, emphasizing to them who you are. And I think the underlying meaning behind this microaggression is that they have a particular idea of who can be a doctor, you know, only males, or maybe it's having a person of color come up to them who is a physician, right? So again, this is a nice way to not diminish the role of nurses, because that is not what is at play here, but also being very clear of who and what you are. And so this is another common one. Black medical student being mistaken as janitorial or food service worker. This happens to Black residents as well, and sometimes our attendings of color, right? Again, this goes back to the microaggression we already talked about, where you know, there are certain roles that people can't see people of color actually taking on, and being a physician is one of them. So a way to combat this is, "Thank you for the compliment, but I'm Dr. Smith, and I'll be taking care of your daughter today. How long has she been dealing with X, Y, or Z?" Right?
Real quick, I'll interject because we had a couple Q&A. So someone said, and this is super interesting, the same issue happens to male nurses being mistaken for physicians, right?
Yes, and it goes back to that same thing. We have our preconceived notions, our implicit bias about who can be in what roles. When I say the word cheerleader, I'm pretty certain that most of us think of a woman being a cheerleader, but we know we can have male cheerleaders, right? This is implicit bias just coming out. So that is a great comment. I completely agree.
Great comment. There's also a question from an anonymous attendee. Should you have the same response with a new colleague? I would say that the response is slightly different, but you still honor the fact that you're not diminishing the role of the nurse, right? But so a lot of these responses that we're going to give you are specifically designed to open up the door for further dialogue, right? So if you say, you know, "Oh, it's interesting, that you say that, because a lot of times people mistake me as the nurse when I'm the doctor. And then you can say, you know, there's a lot of implicit bias in that, and you can talk about it, right? You can talk about the fact that, hey, I once participated in this workshop.
Yep.
A male nurse talked about how he's often, mistaken for the physician, and then just sort of lean into that conversation. Dr. Naka?
Yep, I completely agree. I think that's a great way to do it. Another way to do it is to say, oh, that's interesting. I'm really curious why you thought I was the nurse rather than the physician. Can we talk about that? Right? And I think it depends on the relationship, right? So again, doing your pre-work, who is this person to you? What is the relationship you have in place? That's definitely going to inform how you choose to engage and address this microaggression. So this is another one that I get all the time. You look too young to be a doctor, right? So there are a couple of ways that you can approach this, right? So again, trying to be gracious, but you can say something like, you know what they say about sunscreen. I've been taking care of patients for X years, and I also have the wonderful benefit of having many colleagues on my team who have many more years of experience. So that might be a response for a student or a trainee. As a seasoned attending, I might say something like, thank you so much for the compliment. After I talk to you about what brought you here today, we can talk about healthy eating and exercise. They definitely have helped to keep me looking young, right? So, it's a nice way to make it very clear that you very much have the experience to be a doctor. I have addressed this particular microaggression in a couple of different ways. I might, be very direct and say, thank you, but I just want to assure you that I've completed all of the necessary training to be with you today, and I'm super excited to take care of your child. Tell me a little bit more about what brought you in, right? Just be very matter of fact and don't even give it any airtime. So this is also one that is common. So do you even have any children? This is one that as a pediatrician, we get a fair amount. And so I think it's the underlying message here is, do you even have the experience to be giving me advice on what to do with my kid, right? So you might say something like, actually, I don't have kids of my own. The kids are the reason why I went to med school. I love children, and I've taken care of a lot of them starting way back when I was a babysitter or a nanny. You can be certain that I am deeply committed to doing what is absolutely best and safest for you and your child. So that could be a response to this type of microaggression.
Okay, real quick, I'm monitoring these chats.
Yes, thank you.
So this is Diana. I am a 60-year-old white woman who has been involved in D&I work since middle school. I also do not have a poker face. Welcome to the club. I have been told many times throughout my life that I should watch my face or fix my face, right? I respond with, I have seen myself in the mirror and I am owning my face at this time, fully knowing what is expressing. I love it.
I'm here for it, and I'm stealing it because
We're stealing it.
Because I do not have a poker face. I mean, I just give these looks.
I love it.
I'm using that line. Thank you.
Do we have some hands raised? Do we have questions, or are those people who don't have a poker face?
There may be people who don't have a poker face. So
yeah,
I feel good. I feel validated.
Right. Seriously. Diana said, please do steal it. Yes. I love it.
I'll give you credit.
We will.
Awesome.
Okay. So now I'm going to read over some different cases, and I'm going to so we sent that script to you last night. It was like a two-side page, two-pager of different like language. Patricia says she doesn't have a poker face either. So yeah, we got to work on that.
Yes, we do.
We need to have like a support group.
Yes.
But So the scripts that we sent are kind of going to be a lot of the things that we're using as we're formulating these responses that we're going to share with you today. And so we're going to walk through these cases and some other experiences, and then we're going to give you guys a chance to practice on those situations that left you in a states of response paralysis. So you're going to get to practice and then share with the group some responses that you would have after today. So look at this situation. 3 female faculty members are standing in the hallway discussing a work-related matter when John, a fellow faculty member, walks up to them and says, "What are you girls talking about? Next thing you know, you'll be making appointments for manicures. Come on, we have work to do." Raise your hand, sisters, if you have been called girls before. Yes, I'm raising mine. Yes. Okay, we see you. We feel you.
Yes.
So this is a potential response. So this is one that falls under the category of expressing your feelings. I know you may not intend it this way, but I always cringe when I hear you refer to grown women as girls because it sounds so demeaning. Besides, you don't refer to grown men as boys. It would be far more respectful, accurate, and appropriate to refer to them as men and women. You could also use the strategy of highlighting the person's intelligence. And this is like a good one when you're like really close with that individual and the playing field, like, you know, you're at the same level on the totem pole. Come on, you're way too smart to say something that ignorant or offensive, John. You could use humor. Now listen, do not use humor when there's a power differential. This is another one when you're talking about like colleagues, peers. Ha! It's funny that you mention it. We were actually planning our next slumber party. Unfortunately, you won't be able to come because our parents said that there were no boys allowed. This is one that happens to me on a regular basis. Titles being used for everyone except for the underrepresented minority or the woman in the room. Raise your hands if this has happened to you. Yep. All the time. So I'm sharing with you guys a situation that happened to me just before we sort of had to take our little hiatus because of COVID-19. So my boss was invited to give a talk in an unnamed division. She had a scheduling conflict, so she asked me if I could take care of it. It's really simple because it was a presentation about our office and sort of the resources that we provide. So I know that like the back of my hand. So it was like, yes, sure. So I got to the meeting location early, went to upload my slides. When the woman who was running the meeting entered the room and approached the podium and said, "Hello, Jamila. Is that how I pronounce your name?" And I responded, "Yes, you know, you got it right on the first try. That doesn't always happen, you know," trying to be a little lighthearted. And then I said, "Well, what's your name?" Because she was actually one faculty member that I'd never met before. So I said, "What's your name?" And she responded, "My name is Dr. So-and-so." So immediately, you know, that was me. Because I started thinking like, so if you're going to come up to me calling me Jamila, you know, and she knew that I wasn't her original invitee. So I guess she thought Dr. Khan had sent her minion to do the presentation. I don't know what she was thinking. But she called me by my first name. And then I thought when I asked her what her name was, that she would, you know, tell me what her first name was. I've never had a colleague, a fellow faculty member introduce him or herself to me or themselves to me as a Dr. So-and-so, right? So this was my response to her. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were on a first name basis. If not, then I'm Dr. Hackworth, not Jamila," right? I think this has happened to me so many times that in different programs during introductions, you know, as a facilitator of leadership programs, I had a colleague who would always introduce everyone else who was going to be facilitating as Dr. this, Dr. that, and Jamila. And so I always model the behavior that I want to see. So I'll be calling Dr. Unaka, Dr. Unaka. Sometimes I might slip up because we're cool. And so I might be like, "Hey, Dee Dee," but you know, I'm working really hard and I'm super cognizant of making sure that I use her title. And also, sometimes I've had to sort of address this, and I've done it in a way, you know, I'm sure you didn't realize this, but you introduced everyone else using their titles. So I would be very grateful or very appreciative if you would do the same for me next time. I've had a lot of, you know, good relationships that have been born out of these uncomfortable conversations. And so I know that a lot of us are probably not, you know, we're typically want to avoid the conflictual situation. I'm going to encourage you to sort of lean into it because, you know, folks don't know what they don't know, right? So here's an example, another situation that I experience on a regular basis. So Jamal, he's a Black medical student. You can substitute this. It could be a faculty member, it could be a woman, it could be finishes giving his talk, and several majority race colleagues come up to him and say, "Oh my God, you're so articulate." Here's my strategy for that. This is actually what I do. I ask for clarification or additional information. Could you please tell me more about what your initial expectations were? And that opens up the door for people to be like, that didn't come out right. I didn't mean it that way. And it opens up the opportunity for me to talk about, you know, what that means, right? Separating intent from impact. And also helping my colleagues understand, like, you would say, that was a great talk, great information shared. I learned a lot. Say the same thing. Uh-oh, can you hear me? Okay. So just say, great job, that was a great talk. We don't have to say like you were so articulate, right? Okay, I think I see questions. I'm gonna pause. Oh, this is hilarious. I had to take counseling to keep my job due to eye-rolling behavior, ERB. Love it. Thank you so much. I have to hop off now. Okay. Oh yeah, the president does that to Dr. Yes. Back to Dr. Hackworth's story about the high-level man that made the comments that were offensive and she confronted. I think this highlights, don't assume the individual is malicious or intending to be offensive. They may just simply need to be educated. Absolutely. And that's why we're doing this right now, because the onus is on all of us, everybody, to begin to challenge these things and help educate our colleagues, because I believe we do have a responsibility for their development. How do we respond to our friends' kids calling us Mrs., assuming we changed our name when we got married, when we go by Dr. maiden name? You know, I think it's just a little conversation to say, you know, not all women are married, or not all women change their names when they're married. So the best way to do it, to avoid making a mistake, is just to say Ms., right? You know, just educate. Okay. So next is, we have a URM, underrepresented minority resident, working on a project with several majority race colleagues when one of his team members says, "Your family must be really proud of you for making it this far with your education. You are such a credit to your race." Has anybody ever heard a similar comment? Yep. Okay. So, Kara, I see that your hand has been raised. Do you have something that you would like to add? No? Okay. All right. So we'll keep it moving. So one strategy in this situation is to challenge the stereotype and provide alternative perspectives. So I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but that statement is actually a stereotype, as it sends the message that you feel that it's unusual for people of color to be intelligent, you know, and there are plenty of extremely intelligent people of color, including, and you could just go on and list people if that's what you feel like doing on that day. A newcomer to the committee, Jamila, is attending her first meeting when, after introductions, one committee member says, "Your name is so difficult to pronounce. Can I call you something that is easier to say?" This happens to me a lot. I don't think Jamila is that hard to say, but whatever. So here's my strategy. This is like this is a golden strategy. Restate or paraphrase. When you do this, you let people hear how crazy they sound. So I think I heard you say that my name was too hard for you to pronounce, and you want to call me something different that's easier for you to say. Is that correct? And I've had people literally say, oh my God, that sounded so bad. I did not mean it. And I'm like, I totally get it. Then that opens the door to the conversation about when you call someone their name, you honor who they are as an individual and you show your respect to them, right? And so I have colleagues who have very difficult names to pronounce. I purposely learn how to pronounce them and call them by their full names when, you know, a lot of people have opted to shorten their names because, like I said, it is a sign of respect. And when you say this, guys, you got to fix your face. The Fix Your Face crew, you know, we got to get it together. The eye rollings, the eye rolling crew. Yeah, okay. Lynn Schoenfeld has her hand raised.
Lynn might have been just agreeing.
Okay. All right. So Aaron says, I'm a white guy. I try to connect with people through joking. I want that to be the way to link with people, not insult people. I appreciate comedians who shine the light on racism through their humor. From your perspective, should that be off limits? Not sure how to better ask that question. I appreciate your question. And I would say it should definitely be off limits unless you know that the individual who you're interacting with is okay with that, because this is the assumption that, you know, everybody's going to be okay with everything. And Dr. Unaka is going to talk a little bit about humility as opposed to competency when it comes to culture. And you know, I think that the safe way to do it is to not do the joking thing, right? Unless you know that you have that type of relationship with that individual. And also understanding that even if you have that relationship with someone, if you have observers in the room, they might not be okay with that, right? So you have to be very careful. And Dee Dee, do you have anything else?
I think that is exactly right. I think really taking into consideration the relationship and your audience, because I think your intent to really connect and break down barriers and walls can be totally misconstrued depending on the content of the joke. And, you know, I'm a jokester too, like I totally get it. And I think that question is a really important one. And I really appreciate you asking it.
Yep. And we have some consensus in the group, in the chat saying, don't joke. Like, yeah, the joke should be off limits, but thank you so much. Now we have, tell me if I say your name correctly. Is it Charis? You can type in and say yes or no. She says, that one is always so weird to me because I have a very unusual and hard to pronounce name, but I'm white and I've never been asked if people can call me something else instead. You hit the nail on the head. Oh, Charis. Charis? Can somebody unmute her so she can tell us how to say her name appropriately, please?
Charis.
Charis.
Okay. So sorry that I didn't do that correctly initially, but great point that you make. I love the video where an author talks about if people can learn to pronounce Tchaikovsky, then they can pronounce her name. Absolutely. Totally agree. It's basically, it is a sign of disrespect, right? It's like, you don't even mean enough to me for me to learn how to say your name. And let me just, I'm going to add something onto that. When you have people of color and people walk up to me and they call me Ndidi and they call her Jamila, like, don't do that. You know, we don't look alike. All Black people don't look alike. We need you to learn our individual names and our individual things about us that make us unique. And I think you message that by your willingness to get to know folks and call them who they're given names.
Yes, and that's a critical point. And I think it's an experience that those who are in the majority probably aren't aware of, but it happens time and time and time again. I am constantly mistaken for the handful of other Black physicians in the hospital. and we look nothing alike. And it makes you feel invisible, that we are just, individuals who replace one another, and we are completely and totally unseen.
Yep. All right, let's see. Oh, a few facts. So I want to, as we get ready to move into the next phase of the talk. So a lot of the responses that we gave, that I just gave you, and that Dr. Unaka gave in this previous, the previous slides, are really the individuals who are on the receiving end, sort of responding in those situations or post situation. But I wanted to highlight the fact that organizations and work units absolutely have unspoken thresholds for the amount of disruption to whiteness, white privilege, or racism that they will accept from Black folks. It is just, that is the truth, okay? These are unspoken thresholds, but they exist. However, even though we know that the unspoken thresholds exist, the burden to call out unfair practices, microaggressions, blind spots, racism, macroaggressions, everything disproportionately rests on the shoulders of people of color, for all the reasons that you guys talked about, right? And the graph, or the quadrant that Dr. Unaka, I was going to call you Dr. Ndidi, Dr. Unaka shared earlier, this idea that sometimes people are quiet because they don't want to be seen as, aggressive, or they want to be liked, or they don't want to hurt people's feelings. So what happens is this burden falls on us, the people who are actually oppressed and the intended targets of some of these comments, intended or unintended. And the last thing I would like to say, the last fact, is I would like to tell you that your privilege as white people on this call, our privileges as, heterosexual people. So, not only do white people have privileges, we all have certain levels of privilege, but white privilege is the gift that keeps on giving, okay? White privilege is an unacknowledged system of favoritism and advantage that has been granted to white people as the beneficiaries of historical conquest. That's just it. Throughout history, privilege has been granted to white people. The benefits of white privilege include preferential treatment, exemption from group oppression, immunity from perpetuating social inequity, etc. And let me just be really super clear, because I have a lot of white friends who have, had it super rough growing up, just as I personally did. Not all Black people did, but I did. However, this does not mean that your life hasn't been hard, right? It just means that your skin color is not one of the things that's making it harder, right? So what that means is that you don't get harassed for existing in public locations. You don't get asked if your name could be shortened because it's difficult to pronounce. You're the dominant representation in all media, and products are designed with you in mind. Your actions are not, they do not evoke a collective indictment on your entire race. You have the benefit of being judged individually, time after time after time, no matter what other people in your race do, right? This is white privilege. And so what we're about to move into now, and Dr. Unaka is going to take us through, is this idea that co-conspirators are actually essential bias interrupters, and racist interrupters, and microaggressions interrupters. We need white people to stand up and begin to challenge some of these things if we're really going to change anything. Because I told you guys, we're making a choice. We know the fear of retaliation is real. We know we're having these interactions and experiences on a regular basis, so we're picking and choosing. Juice worth the squeeze? No, some of these things we just don't have the energy to deal with. It's a constant, battle, constantly trying to manage ourselves and how we're even experienced when we decide to go in and address these things. So if you don't leave with anything else today, I hope you leave with a call to action to move, to be a co-conspirator in this thing with us. So ally versus co-conspirator. I think allies have profuse emotional outpouring, and it's followed by severe inaction. Okay, I'm gonna give you an example. Myself, like there are a lot of things that mortify me that are going on in society right now, but I'm not actively like trying to make a difference in all of those areas. Doesn't mean that I'm any less like emotional about it or mortified or just disgusted, but I'm just really not actively trying to change the outcome for the individuals in those situations. But if I move toward co-conspiratorship, I'm moving past, you know, you got to move past the guilt that you have. If you're white and you're having white guilt and you have white shame, I think that, you know, there's a lot of, that's a big package right there. You got to be able to process through that. I'm reading this book right now and I found it super helpful. It's called White Fragility, to really unpack some of that stuff around these conversations about race and privilege. But you need to move past that and then take responsibility for the power and privilege that you hold, that we hold. Me as a cisgender heterosexual woman, I have some power as compared to my LGBTQ colleagues, right? How am I using that power and privilege to really facilitate substantive change for oppressed individuals? And I think that's where we have to get to. I'm done with allies, right? And my mentor, one of my mentors, Dr. Bettina Love, gives this story about allies versus co-conspirators. The pictures at the bottom, the mugshots, those pictures are pictures of Bree Newsome and James Tyson in South Carolina when Dylan Roof shot up the Bible study class at the church and killed all those African Americans who had invited, you know, he asked, could he come in? And they said, yes, absolutely, come in. And then he like turned a gun on him and killed him. And then the police actually took him to Burger King after he was peacefully arrested and because he was hungry, and then took him for booking. These two individuals were selected to help take down the Confederate flag. And they wanted Bree Newsome. They said, you know what? We want a Black woman to be able to do it. That's symbolic. So they taught her how to climb, told her everything she needed to know. And then James Tyson was going to be there with her on the day of to help her accomplish the task of removing the Confederate flag. So they show up. Bree Newsome jumps the fence, begins to go up the pole. At this point, James decides, am I going to be an ally or a co-conspirator? An ally would stay on the outside of the fence, perhaps. And he taught her how to climb. You know, he might have given her some insights. And he might have been a lookout for her to say, you know what, oh my gosh, here they come, hurry up, they're on the way. You know, I see them, I hear the sirens. Well, what James Tyson did was he said, I'm gonna be a co-conspirator. Maybe he didn't use those words, but he also jumped the fence with Bree Newsome. He was on the inside with her when the authorities arrived. And when they went to ask her to get down, they were trying to figure out how they were gonna get her off the pole. One of the cops was like, you know, we could tase the pole. Okay, so you know, if they'd have tased the pole, Bree Newsome probably would have died. Well, James Tyson recognized that he had privilege, and he put his hand, his white hand, on that pole because he knew that they were not going to tase that pole with his hand on it. He saved her life, right? That's a co-conspirator. And I think this is what we need in order to begin to tackle this and to begin to educate our colleagues about this. We need people to co-conspire. What are the qualities of a co-conspirator? One thing is they identify and name racism directly. It is what it is. Silence, as Dr. Unaka said, is violence. And as our participant on the call, our brother said, it's also protecting power. Recognizing a co-conspirator recognizes that choosing to remain silent or neutral or objective in situations where people are being harmed is actually a form of privilege and violence. A co-conspirator also struggles daily with understanding and undoing aspects of his or her own privilege. There's not like a special place that you arrive at where you realize like, okay, I'm woke and I got this. It's an evolutionary process every day, understanding privilege, understanding systemic racism and how this thing, you know, has really worked to oppress so many people for so many hundreds of years. A co-conspirator will take the front line as a buffer, but not as a savior, all right? They take on racism as a problem because it's personally offensive, but in the process, they also cultivate authentic and mutually beneficial relationships with people of color. They understand that people of color are the experts relative to their own experiences with racism, and that these experiences are absolutely positively not debatable. There's no debate when someone says they've had this experience and their perception and their reality, it's not debatable, right? And lastly, the co-conspirator takes responsibility for self-education and does not expect for people of color to teach them every single thing that they need to know. I'm arguing that if you're friends and you're building authentic relationships with people of color, you're learning, but that is not the sole source of your learning, right? If you're a good co-conspirator. I'll pause here because there are some comments. I accidentally did mistakenly call someone and called her by her colleague's name of the same race. I rarely see either, but no excuse. I apologized. Is there anything else I could have done? Absolutely not. That you did what you should do. I apologize. I got you mixed up. And then you just work harder next time to make sure that you get to know individuals, or, you know, avoid using names. And what I do a lot of times is I'll take a quick look at the badge before I'll say a name. Let's see, I'm a teacher of English to speakers of other languages. I learn a lot of new phenome combinations in the course of class. I rely on the comfort level of the students to determine pronunciation accuracy. I check with them, not necessarily in whole class situations, until I've said the name to their satisfaction. It takes work, but it's necessary. Basic respect. Also, in my teaching and learning experience, generally, most of us just want to communicate and are looking for a level of basic respect, not native speaker accuracy. Tones, for example, are dodgy for adults whose first language is not tonal. Thank you so much for sharing that, because that is absolutely what we need to do. The author's name is, let's see. I was furiously, oh, okay, let me see. This is, okay. I don't connect this. Let me see I'm trying to connect to your comment, Alyssa. I don't see the previous comment. So if you add that in, I see the author's name is Uzo Aduba. I was furiously Googling and you sent us a link. I don't see how to connect that, but if you can let me know as I read through the rest of these comments, we will. Oh my gosh, we are like so running over. Oh, yikes.
Yes, I want to be respectful of time. So I wonder if we should try and get through the rest of this and then go from there. And Rosie, do you guys have another session right after this?
The next session is at 12.
Okay, sounds good. Want to be respectful of everyone's time because I know we are like literally 30 minutes over. So let's actually talk through some of these scenarios of how a co-conspirator would respond to some of the microaggressions we already highlighted. So we had our microaggression where female faculty were referred to as girls, and Brian, who is our co-conspirator in this case, witnessed and overheard this comment. And so one response that a co-conspirator or one strategy that a co-conspirator could use is using learnings from your own mistakes to help others. And I think this is really powerful and effective because number one, you are being transparent and open with the fact that you have made similar mistakes. And I think that really helps bring down the walls of defense for the person who is receiving the critique. So you could say something like, I've used the term girls in reference to women before, but a friend told me that being called girls is very offensive to grown women. I've learned that it is far more respectful, accurate, and appropriate to refer to them as women, just like we would refer to men as men and not boys. So this microaggression involved the URM resident who was noted to be a credit to his race because of his performance. And Amanda, in this case, is the co-conspirator who witnessed this statement. So another strategy for a co-conspirator response here would be to highlight the person's intelligence. And I think this works well when you have a strong relationship with the person who actually made the offensive statement. So you could say something like, come on, Megan, you're way too smart to say something that offensive. Did you know that when you say that, you send a message that you believe that it is unusual for a person of color to be intelligent? I think that's an effective strategy. So here we have a medical student who enters a patient's room and introduces herself, and the parent says, where are you from? Your accent is definitely not American, right? So Jackson, our co-conspirator in this case, wants to address this, right? And so this goes back to what Dr. Hackworth has been talking about the entire time: separate intent from impact. So a response could be, I know you didn't mean it this way, but when you make comments like that about people whose second language is English, it makes them feel like outsiders, like they don't belong, or as if they are un-American. Jamal is actually a first-generation American who speaks 3 languages fluently. And so this one is something that comes up often in medicine. So what do you do when a family is asking to see another person due to race, gender, or religious preferences, right? So I think it's really important to consider the reason for the request. Is this blatant bigotry? And if so, that requires a very different response. Or are they seeking concordance from an ethnic, language, or religious standpoint? If this is blatant bigotry, to me, this is very black and white. The rejected provider should get to decide how she or he would want this handled. This needs to be escalated to the powers that be. I think the person who makes the request needs to know that hateful, racist, disrespectful speech or requests will not be tolerated. And you need to make sure you all have a sense of what your formal institutional policies and practices are to support you in making those statements. And this is a YouTube video of an attorney who actually spends a lot of time talking about this. We don't have time to play it now, but it's something that I would definitely take a look at as follow-up to this workshop. And so one way to address this particular issue, you could say a couple of things like, could you tell me more about why you're asking for a provider of a different race, gender, or religion? Or you could say something like, I assure you that my race or ethnicity or religion does not in any way impact my ability to provide excellent care for your child. Could you tell me more about why you're asking for me to be replaced by someone else, right? And so I think this actually really connects to the concept of cultural humility, right? So it is really important that we are able to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented, right? We have to be open to other people in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the person. And I am a huge fan of cultural humility. I actually do not like the term cultural competency. Cultural competency means to me, oh, this person who comes from this particular background or is of this particular race, here are the 5 things that you need to know about them to be aware, and all people of this race or this culture or this background fit into that little box, which is just so not true, right? So cultural humility is different, right? It focuses on self-humility, meaning I don't know everything about a person. I can certainly be aware of cultures, but everyone is different, right? So it's important not to assume that all individuals from a particular background, of a particular religion, have the same cultural practices. Cultural humility is all about honoring your patient or the individual and their unique lived experiences that may influence their interactions with medical providers, right? So this approach requires you acknowledging your own power, privileges, and prejudices, and being able to say, hey, I really want to know what are the unique things I need to know about you in order to build this therapeutic relationship. Jamila, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry, I've been multitasking this whole time. So this quote sort of encapsulates the meaning of this whole co-conspiratorship. So each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, she or he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And so now what we were hoping was that we would have a little bit of time for you to practice with those scenarios that you jotted down a little bit earlier and come up with some responses. And it looks like we still have 77 people on the call. So why don't we do that? So using the handout that I sent last night and the examples that we've given you, if we can get a few people to come up with a response to the scenario that left them in a state of response paralysis prior to this day, and maybe tell us like what you could have said or what you would have said or what you will say, because it's never too late to circle back and help teach your colleagues. So do we want to take a couple seconds and then just raise your hand and let us know if you would like to read your response to the group? Do we have any volunteers? This is the good thing about Zoom. People can't just call on you, right? Would anyone like to? You don't have to. Hold on, let me check the chat.
I did see one question in the Q&A section about, you know, what do you do when you're a white woman or a white male and you're trying to balance speaking up or speaking up in a situation where you experience or witness a microaggression, but being careful not to speak on behalf of Black people. And I think that's a really great question and an insightful one. And I really do think it goes back to, I think we all have that litmus test when things, you hear it and you just know it's not right, right? And it doesn't mean to interrupt that bias or microaggression by speaking up, that you are speaking up on behalf of all Black people. But I think it's okay to say, hey, in my experience, I could see how someone might find that to be offensive, and this is why, right? And I think also if you have trusted friends or colleagues who are Black, you can always talk to them or run it by them. You guys all know Dr. Hackworth and I, feel free, you can reach out to us. We're happy to talk through stuff like that too, if you are unsure. But I think we all know when something doesn't sit right. And it doesn't mean you're speaking on behalf of all Black people, but I do think it's really important to disrupt or interrupt those instances where your Black colleagues may not feel comfortable or are tired of always having to be the one to interrupt those racist comments.
So now I guess we're finished. I think we're over 10 minutes, sorry. Do you have any questions for us that you haven't asked so far? Please do. You can go in the chat or you can raise your hand and you can be unmuted. Questions or comments? And while you're thinking about that, we just want to thank you for your time today. I think that it's amazing that you guys took a couple hours out of your day to participate in this. And I'm looking at the comments and the messages, and I really feel so grateful, and I think I can speak on behalf of Dr. Unaka too, that you guys chose to spend this time with us talking about some things that sometimes are a bit difficult to talk about. I would also add that we are definitely available. You all should have received an email from me last night, and Dr. Unaka was copied on that. Feel free to contact us if we can be helpful. And we will send out the resources list along with a short evaluation, a retrospective pre-post eval based on this seminar. So if you could do us a favor and fill that out, let us also know what we can change to make this better the next time we do it. We would be truly grateful for that. Anything else, Dr. Unaka?
No, I just want to echo Dr. Hackworth. Thank you for having us. I hope this was something that was thought-provoking and informative. I certainly always learn from all of you, and we don't take it for granted that you took the time to spend with us this morning.
Oh, I see one question. In your perspective, do you feel like it's better to address a racist comment in the moment, or is it better to address it with someone privately after the moment, or does it really depend on the situation? I would say that it absolutely depends on the situation, because there may be some things that are so egregious that they need to be addressed in that moment. Yes. For me, the majority of the situations that I've intervened in, I've been able to handle those after the fact relatively closely. And a lot of reasons why, you know, because I don't want to embarrass people. Also because sometimes I'm just flat out angry, and that's never a good time to be able to have these conversations. Dr. Unaka?
Yeah, I agree. I think it totally depends. You know, I think the example of like a patient or a family member refusing care because of someone's skin color, you know, I think even if you choose to circle back with that patient or family, I think what is super important is that the person who experienced the bigotry or the microaggression know that you recognize it and that you are going to handle it. Because I think sometimes these discussions that happen in private are great, but the person who experienced it doesn't know that anyone actually noticed enough to care or actually address it. So I think it depends, but please make sure that the person who experienced it feels supported as well, and knows that things are going to be addressed at a later time.
All right, so
all right.
I guess we're out of here. Thank you guys so much. Thanks so much, Rose, and is it Thomas? Wait a minute, let me see. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.